Learning occurs in many ways: reading, writing, observing, and doing. Montgomery College's access to history is for the doers. Our guests have participated in actions or events that we now recognize as part of history. In the studio, they sit down, mic up, and have conversations with faculty and students from Montgomery College. There is no host, no flashy set, and no commercials, just people and their stories. Sometimes the stories date back many years, and sometimes the story is current. It's all historical, and it's part of Montgomery College's access to history.
I'm Stan Salett. I'm the author of a recent book, The Edge of Politics, Stories from the Civil Rights Movement, the War on Poverty, and the Challenges of School Reform. These themes have informed my life, have woven together my story and some of history. I hope you'll find it interesting.
You've had such a varied and interesting life, and there's really so much to talk about today. We really need to get started. Let's be logical here and go back to the beginning. You came from a political family. You were born in Boston, which is a notoriously political town. Mm-hmm. But you had some pretty early political memories. Why don't you share some of those with us?
Well, I was born in Roxbury and grew up in Dorchester. And I think my earliest memories, probably of anything, were of my mother on the telephone calling voters to come out and vote for my uncle, who probably at that time was running for the city council. And for some reason, I remember that the voting lists were in blue, and my mother would run down and give her talk and then go to the next number and the next number. So it happened very early. And my mother would later tell me that that was not my first political contact. She said as a baby in the mid-1930s, FDR was campaigning in Dorchester, and she was standing on the curb, and she raised me on high. I don't know which end was front to see the President of the United States passing by. So maybe that was my first political contact.
And also, I think you mentioned that you had been chosen as when Curley was mayor.
Yes, when Curley was mayor, and of course James Michael Curley, the model for John Hersey's book, The Last Hurrah, every 4th of July there would be a major parade, major for us anyway, down Blue Hill Avenue. And for a couple of years I was the little boy given a little flag and placed in front of the parade to lead it down the avenue. And I always thought maybe it was because I was good looking. I had blonde curly hair in those days. Little did I know that probably it was a political payoff of one kind or another. That was Boston.
Now, I don't want to embarrass you, but you did put some of this stuff in your book. And by the way, I want to urge everyone to check out Mr. Salett's book. It's called The Edge of Politics, Stories from the Civil Rights Movement, the War on Poverty, and the Challenges of School Reform. And that is a mouthful, but this man has had a mouthful of a career. So, but you weren't exactly the perfect child, even though you were the baby that was chosen to be held up. You were a little bit of a handful when you were a teen. Why don't you talk about some of your escapades?
Well, as a teen, particularly as a young teen, I found school rather boring. And starting in the 7th grade, I entered Boston Latin School via an exam. And the learning was largely what we would call now by rote. And we were given 3 hours of homework every night to do. And I found that sort of rudimentary, so let me say. And I searched for more excitement, and part of the excitement was gambling. And so I had a neighborhood group that I gambled with and worked up table stakes for larger games that I would later get into, even as a young teenager.
And I recall reading about one scrape that you had involving a car, but it seemed to inform you also about race relations in America.
Yes.
Could you tell us about that incident?
Sure. Part of trying to find excitement outside of school brought me together with a small group of friends, and we would borrow, I should use the term in quotes, borrow a car over the weekend. And the car was owned by a traveling salesman. So it had no back seat, and it had a large pole that went from side to side in the inside of the car that was used to hang suits or dresses or something that the salesman sold on the road during the week. So we knew where the car was parked, and we had sufficient keys to get into it, and we would take it and brought it back exactly in the same spot and so on. Nothing was disturbed, and so that all went quite well until one weekend where we hadn't checked the gas gauge, and we were driving up Seaver Street, which was again a major street in Roxbury and Dorchester, and the car ran out of gas. So we pulled it off to the side of the road, and we're trying to figure out what to do with the car and to try to get some gas when a police car pulled up. And the police asked, well, what was going on there? And so we all pointed to a building, hopefully the same building across the way, and said, well, somebody had just run out of gas and he'd gone into this building maybe to make a phone call, and he asked us to watch it for him. And the police said, oh, well, we'll just wait until he comes back and we'll help you watch the car. And they may have thought there was something suspicious from the outset because we were an interracial group. There were 4 of us, and one of the kids was African American. And finally, when time passed and clearly nobody emerged from that building, the officer said, well, I think you guys better come down to the station with us. So we got in the police car, went down to the station, and at that point we were divided. So the African American kid had been in trouble with the juvenile authorities, and to that extent probably had some kind of record. He tried to bolt out the door. He actually tried to run away. And they caught him and dragged him down, started to beat on him and dragged him off. And the rest of us were sort of divided, and I was in a room. I remember sitting on a long wooden bench, and at one end of the bench there was a big officer who happened to be African American, big guy, football player size, and he put one of his legs up on the bench and took out his revolver and started to clean it or something, and started to ask me questions, and they were all directed pretty much at that African American kid. Well, he put you up to it, didn't it? He really knew what was going on. Why don't you tell me about that? And I said, no, we were all in this together, and so on. After that, they called my house. My father came down, got me out, told me, never mention this to your mother, which I never did. And at a later time, that was probably expunged because one of my uncles was assistant U.S. attorney for the city of Boston and probably took care of that for me.
So what you saw there was basically a different handling based on race.
Yes, yeah, and that was clear. It was part of the environment that one grew up with in the city of Boston during those years.
Well, that's for sure. Let's go back to your educational years there a little bit. You mentioned you went to Boston Latin, which is also the oldest school in the United States. And then you went to Brandeis. Mm-hmm. You went to college at Brandeis, which at the time was almost a brand new university. 2 completely different types of schools. Tell us how they differed and what kind of credit you would give to these schools as a contribution to your success.
Well, Latin school was really all about discipline. When we entered in the 7th grade, we were all first asked to sit down and meet in the large auditorium. So there were probably in the incoming class maybe 300 to 350 students. And the headmaster stood up and gave a general introduction to the school, and then at some point in his description, he asked us to look on either side of us. And he said, this is a very rigorous school, and if you look at the person on your right and the person on your left, one of you is not going to be here at the time that you graduate. And so it was a very, very rigorous time. Latin was compulsory every year. The major liberal innovation in the curriculum was the choice we had between German and Greek starting in our freshman high school year, and everything else was clearly laid out. The high school itself, as you said, was the oldest school in the country, founded in 1635, the year before Harvard. And it was traditionally the prep school for Harvard, but a public school. And each year the head of admissions at Harvard would almost in ceremonial fashion come across the Charles River and meet with the guidance counselor, head of guidance at Boston Latin School. And they would never talk about an individual student. They would only talk about a number. And the number was how many students from Latin School would go in that year. And pretty much if you graduated in the top half of your class, you had that as an opportunity. It was only much later that I found that Harvard was such a big deal. To me at the time, it would have been a commuting school. And a commuting school, commuting at Harvard, was really being treated as a second-class citizen, and your introductory courses largely taught by graduate students. It was not a superior education experience. And so I had to look elsewhere. And Brandeis was a relatively new school and was offering me full scholarships. I had a scholarship from the city of Boston, a fund there. And so I was able to go to Brandeis without any real stress on my parents' very modest income.
Well, you talked about when you went to Brandeis, one passage I remember quite clearly is you talked about a debate that you saw that when you left that debate, you said you felt like it would affect the rest of your life. You remember what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, this would have been in 1956. And in 1956 was a critical year in our history. It was the time of the Suez invasion between Britain, France, and Israel, which the United States and Eisenhower not only refused to participate in, but condemned, and really caused the withdrawal of those forces from Egypt. It was also the time of the Hungarian Revolution. And that became a critical point of discussion among political parties and individuals within the United States, particularly on the left side of the political system. And so there was one evening set aside at Brandeis for a discussion, really a debate, on the significance of the Hungarian Revolution. And the university invited Howard Fast, great American author, novelist, and then a member of the American Communist Party, to come up to debate with Louis Koser, who had been my sociology professor and the translator of Max Weber, one of the great sociologists of all time. And Koser and his partner Irving Howe had founded Dissent magazine, and they were socialists and definitely not communists, very much anti-communist. So the debate then revolved around what was the significance of the Hungarian Revolution, what did it mean? And Fast said that the Hungarian Revolution was really not a revolution. It was a counter-revolution. It was an attempt by fascists to take over the communist government and reinstall the kind of fascist government that had been in power during the Second World War and had aligned themselves with Italy and Germany. And Koser strongly disagreed. But Fass used some very, very dramatic language. He said that they were hanging Jews from telephone poles in Budapest, and that's what was coming, and so on. And of course, this was not true, and Koser really took him on. And Koser's background was from European socialists and so on, who had fought against the Nazis and from his time in Austria. And he, one point in the discussion, he turned to Howard Fass and he said, "How can you say what you say?" He said, "There is blood on your hands." And a shiver went through. There were probably 300 or 400 students sitting cross-legged wherever they could, crowded into this commons room. And we somehow, through this discussion, were taken back to the kinds of discussions that were going on all over the United States during the 1930s, where political discussions and neighborhoods and parties were so vital to the lifeblood of the country during the Roosevelt administration. And all what we had learned in textbooks and studied and so on just became real, that what we were learning counted for something. It mattered.
I can see why that would have affected you, given the career that you've had. Now, at about the same time, as a matter of fact, 1955, if I'm correct, you started working in your first political campaign, and you had a key role in it. And tell us about that and what you did for that campaign. That was the state senate campaign, I believe.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, that's it was a bit of happenstance. This was a neighborhood a person who had become a state senator, and he had asked me to help him in the campaign. He had run into some difficulty because he had become involved in a surprising neighborhood political issue. By the way, this is a side point. One of the secrets in politics is to never forget the importance of animals in political campaigns. Dogs and cats, and this was a bigger story than that. Because in Dorchester, the big zoo and the big park was the Franklin Park Zoo, and the hippopotamus passed away. And so the state senator promised that he would raise the money to replace that hippopotamus. And so he attempted to do that and raise the money and so on, but through a variety of circumstances wasn't able to complete the deal. And now he was under great stress and pressure because he was seen as being politically vulnerable. And so I suppose my involvement was to help him write a political tract titled, I think, My Heart is in Ward 14. And what I tried to do in the political tract is basically say that he was, although a worthy man, he lacked the education that his opponents had. There was a lawyer running against him, at least one lawyer, an accountant, a businessman, and his entire life was in politics. He had come out of the Second World War, he was a veteran, and everything followed from that was all in politics. And so the underscore never said was that if he was defeated, he would be not only out of politics, he'd probably be out of a job, right? But all his opponents, if they lost, they could go back to their business, to their accountant business, their law, and so on. Another part of the strategy was to praise them in the tract, which was sort of unusual, particularly in these days where you always attack your opponents, because part of the strategy was to keep them in the race, because the entire race would be decided in the Democratic primary. So all he had to do was to gain maybe 35% of the vote in order to gain the Democratic nomination. And they stayed in the race. It was a multiple candidate, and he won with that.
So your first campaign, and you were a winner. Now, we're going to talk about a lot of the people that you have worked with and met over your career, and it's a fascinating panorama of people. But one of the ones that, and I know this is just a small incident, but one of the ones that really intrigued me was when you went to California and you spent a couple of days with Lenny Bruce's father.
Uh-huh.
And for those out there in our audience who don't remember, Lenny Bruce was sort of like an early George Carlin.
Mm-hmm.
A very acerbic, political, sharp-tongued sort of comedian. And you ended up spending some time with his dad. Tell us about that.
By the way, just as background, Dustin Hoffman made a wonderful movie where he played Lenny Bruce, and it may have been called The Lenny Bruce Story.
I believe it was called Lenny.
Lenny, yes.
And you're right, it was a very good movie.
Right, I'd recommend it to anybody. Well, again, there were four of us, four, traveling around the country during the summer when not in college. And at times we hitchhiked, at times we had an old Nash automobile that would periodically break down. But we found ourselves in California at a place called Arcadia, which is not far from Claremont, outside of Los Angeles. And one of the group had an uncle who lived there. We didn't know much about him, but we had arranged that we would stay a few nights there. And it turned out that he was Lenny Bruce's father. And so we spent a couple of nights casually drinking, and he would tell stories about Lenny Bruce and how disappointed he was because Lenny Bruce had become sort of a Class B actor, had married a burlesque dancer as his father had, and was having a difficult marriage, and he kept saying, well, his son is much smarter than he was, and he could do better, and so on, and how disappointed he was. But there was another story in the book, and I don't know if you were referring to that as well.
No, that's the story I was talking about.
Okay.
That's the story I was talking. I just found it interesting that here you are, you ended up in Lenny Bruce's father's house, spending a couple of days. And the book is just filled with those kind of things. And another one that really struck me, and it was really fascinating, was your trip to Cuba right after the Cuban Revolution, right after Castro had taken over. Tell us about what happened when you went down there.
Well, I went down as a guest of someone who was a developer, real estate developer in Cuba, particularly in Havana, and he was convinced that Castro was really a liberal Democrat, and it would be good for the Cuban economy and so on, and really wanted me to meet him. So my lodging was in the Havana Hilton Hotel, which by that time had been renamed the Habana Libre, and the Habana Libre was one of the original atrium hotels, not unlike the Hyatts, where there are very tall trees in the middle and all of the hotel rooms are around the periphery. And I remember being brought up to the 20th floor by a bellhop, and the bellhop taking me out on the balcony and showing me the bullet holes in the ceiling of the outside balcony, and I was being very impressed. What I didn't realize immediately at that time was that there was no real fighting in Havana during the Cuban Revolution. It was a celebration about the exit of Batista and the firing of guns just in the street, and those were the bullet holes. But my host said, asked me, would I like to meet Fidel Castro? And I said, sure. And how would I do that? He said, well, it's not too difficult. He said, you just go down about 1 o'clock in the morning and sit in the lobby, and he'll come by. So that next night I did that, and I stayed till about 1 or 1:15. I was kind of tired, and nobody came, and I thought, well, this is a kind of fanciful story. So I went back upstairs and went to sleep. The next day, of course, my host asked me, did you meet Fidel? And I said, no, he never showed up. He said, what time did you go to bed? And I said, about 1:15. He said, you didn't stay long enough. So the next night, I stayed longer, and probably about 2 in the morning, Fidel comes in with about 6 17-year-olds, all dressed in pressed khaki fatigues, all with rifles, all with their fingers on the trigger. I was more worried about that than anything else.
Yeah, I would
and
say.
Because they didn't seem to be exactly veteran soldiers at that age. And Castro came in, and he immediately impressed me, as he would anybody, with his height and range, his very long arms. He had played basketball as a younger man. And so he came in with his entourage and then sat down on one of the couches, and with these wide sweeping arms said, come here, I'd like to talk to you. And there were a few of us who there, and so we came in, and at first he started to talk about the Cuban Revolution and what it meant, and asked, have you visited our model cooperative farm yet? And I had done that. And he talked about agriculture and how the richness of the Cuban soil was so fertile, and yet Cuba had to import most of its food, and wasn't that a tragedy, and so on. And how he was going to change things so that nobody could be without health service. So there would be national health service, and they would train doctors and nurses and so on. And then education, how he would solve all the problem of adult illiteracy. All these things he did, by the way. And then he paused, and he asked, were there any questions? And so I said to him, well, Fidel, I said, if everything is so great in Cuba, why are so many people leaving? And he looked at me, and he looked at the others, and he said, oh, he said, that's the Havana Yacht Club. He said, they can go.
And he's still alive and kicking.
He is.
All right, well, of course, all good things must pass, and you graduated from college.
Mm-hmm.
You went to graduate school at Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And then you decided to pick education and teaching as your first career. Mm-hmm. Why education and teaching?
Well, I had at college, one of my jobs through the work-study program, and also for some income, I ran the tutoring program, particularly for the athletic center, and then in turn hired other people to teach different courses, and I taught some myself. So that experience was terrific. I really enjoyed it. And so following graduation, I decided to become a teacher, and first taught at Jamaica Plain High School, and then in a second year, for most of the year, came back and taught at my old school, Boston Latin School, much to the surprise and probably chagrin of my teachers. Particularly the first day I walked into the teachers' lounge, they were stunned. One of them, a big guy, McNamara, said, "Salett, what are you doing here?" Gravelly voice and so on. And so I then going to Harvard and picking up a master's degree seemed to be the right thing. And one of the courses was taught by a guy named Larry Kremen, who had come from Columbia, Teachers College, Columbia. And I was just amazed with his work and so on. And basically he recruited me to come to Columbia, and with scholarships and everything, and I became one of his graduate students.
Well, before we get to the New York part, when you were still in Boston, I read a little part in the book. Again, it caught my eye because I've read Death at an Early Age by Jonathan Kozol. Mm-hmm. You taught at a school with him in Boston.
Well, I think I may have been there the year before he was there, but it was the same school.
Timilty School, I think.
The Timilty School,
yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And it was a tough school.
It was a tough school. There was an interesting case at the time. There was a case about a young student who was acting out and a teacher who forcibly restrained the student and maybe hit the student. I don't know all of the details. But the student's family sued the teacher, and at the time, Ted Kennedy was an assistant district attorney, and he agreed to take the case on behalf of the student, and of course the teachers union supported the teacher. And I remember thinking later that this was a very courageous thing to do, coming from a political family where, in order to climb a political ladder, he would obviously have to run for Boston or a state political office, and having gone against the teachers union would not have been the smart political thing to do, but he showed courage. He really believed in the student's case and won the case.
Oh, he did win the case.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I think maybe this is a good time. I've been wanting to ask you, because obviously we teach education here, we groom teachers. What advice would you have for a young person who's thinking about getting into teaching, or even maybe a career changer who's thinking about getting into teaching? What advice would you have for them with your many years of experience as a teacher and an educator?
Well, I think teaching is probably the most difficult work that I've ever done. And very little prepares you for it. You can take courses, you can even take some experiential teaching, but when it's just you and you're in that class, it becomes very, very difficult. So I guess my advice would be, take your first year, or even your first 2 years, as a learning experience. Understand that you know very little about how to interrelate with a class or teach a class. You may know your subject matter, hopefully you do. But your interaction with students, the way you appear personally and the way you relate, becomes much more important in many ways in the beginning of the way you teach than your subject matter. And rely on experienced teachers. Seek them out, try them out, talk to them, ask them advice, ask them to come into your classroom, sit at the end, tell you what you're doing, what you're not doing, and so on. That's probably the best thing, I would say, at the outset, the very beginning. Self-evaluation is really critical.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think, I'm sure they know their subject. It's that whole controlling the classroom and all that. That's very, very good advice. Now, at the same time that you were getting your teaching career going, you started getting into the civil rights movement as well. You got involved with the civil rights movement. How did this come about?
Well, it first happened in Boston. I began to go to some meetings and joined Boston Corps. And so I became familiar with CORE was the Congress of Racial Equality, and through that, some of their role in the civil rights movement. I've been very aware of what was going on in the South. 1956 was also the year of the Montgomery bus boycott, and I had a chance to see Martin Luther King Jr. when he came to Boston and spoke at the Faneuil Hall Forum, and was totally impressed with him. He had received his doctorate from Boston University, and so was very familiar with the area. But more importantly, what he talked about Montgomery and how the bus boycott came about. And at the time, he was a very young minister, at one of the Baptist churches. But his description of civil rights, nonviolent resistance, politics and policy was also wedded with history of India and Gandhi, with classics. He had an enormous wide range of knowledge that he was able to bring to bear. Totally impressive, very impressive.
Well, we'll get back to King in a second, but I also wanted to talk about CORE for another minute. As you mentioned, it was the Congress of Racial Equality. Mm-hmm. At the time, it was probably one of the top 3 or 4 civil rights organizations in the country, along with the NAACP and Southern Leadership Conference. Mm-hmm. But at CORE, you worked very closely with James Farmer, mm-hmm. who was the head of CORE, and you also worked with Julius Hobson, who mm-hmm. ran the D.C. Mm-hmm. chapter. Mm-hmm. Both these guys were legendary figures in the civil rights movement. Tell us a little bit about them and what kinds of people they were to work with.
Well, Farmer had come out of the University of Chicago, and before that he had gone to, maybe it was Lincoln, I'm not sure, the college is a predominantly African-American college, but there was also a film about Farmer as a young debater. He was a wonderful debater. And but while in Chicago, I think he was a member of the War Resisters League and fully adopted passive resistance as part of his life experience. My major contact with him in New York came when I was a graduate student at Columbia, and I was a member of New York Corps, and we met in Harlem on 125th Street. A terrific place. The president there was a woman named Gladys Harrington, very skilled and capable, very impressive group. And my task that I was given was to organize a Corps chapter at Columbia University. So it was that experience that brought me in contact with Farmer.
And then you worked with Hobson when you were down here, and he was quite an interesting character.
Yes. Now, I don't know if you want me to tell the story about Columbia University and their off-campus registry.
You should go into that, because that really that was very enlightening. Mm. I had forgotten some of that.
Mm. The difficulty was how do you create a campus organization when there are so many other organizations going on? And so, in part from what I've learned out of the Boston Corps experience and out of New York Corps, was I did an investigation of the off-campus registry at Columbia University, because Columbia could not house all of its students. And so they actively recruited people to give up rooms in their apartments or apartments in their apartment buildings and so on. And then they provided this service to Columbia University students, both graduate students and undergraduates. And so as I was building the Corps organization on campus, we were running tests of whether the off-campus registry would in effect be steering people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds to particular kinds of apartments or rooms. And we pretty much figured out that they had their own system, typically in those days without computers, a card system, where they would asterisk, no Filipinos, no African Americans, no couples, probably no gays, whatever. All of that was there. And we would test it by sending in people of different backgrounds, asking for the exact same accommodation. And so this was going on at Columbia. At the same time, a guy named Rudy Lombard, who had been one of the freedom writers, was doing as a graduate student at Syracuse. We had somebody else at Chicago. And then we timed it so that Jim Farmer came up to give a major speech in New York about racism in the North and got a lot of press. So his commentary was, yes, you know about Montgomery, yes, you know about the freedom rides, and you know about the bus stations, and you know about all that, but racism is in the North. In fact, it's in some of our finest institutions. And the press then, in the press conference afterwards, said, well, what institutions? Where? He said, well, some of our universities. Well, where? He said, well, the University of Chicago, Syracuse University, and Columbia University. And the New York Times went crazy, among other places. So they asked him, well, who do we talk to? And he said, well, call Stan Salett. So I had arranged, and I knew the calls were going to come, that I gave the Columbia Spectator, the college campus newspaper, the absolute rights to all the stories. Right? So when the New York Times called me, I said, you have to call the Spectator. So think of yourself as the editor of the Spectator, right? And you're getting calls from the New York Times for the story, right? So of course, their story was in the Spectator all of the time. And as a favor, of course, they would have to say, and the core organization is meeting on Thursdays in such and such a hall. So our organization grew and grew and grew. And we put pressure on the university. And as a graduate student, I was getting some pressure, of course, from some of my advisors, not all, to, didn't I want to really pay attention on that doctorate because, you couldn't do all this organizing stuff and so on. But several people resigned from the administration, including the head of the off-campus registry, and they completely changed their system.
And CORE was instrumental in that happening.
And we had a CORE chapter at Columbia, yeah.
Now, back to Julius Hobson. You worked with him down in D.C. because eventually you made your way down to D.C.
Right.
And he sounded like a very interesting guy.
He was very interesting. Well, I was set down with an implicit message to watch out for this guy. Because what happens often, and with all sorts of national organizations, when they have Washington chapters, the press often does not go to the national office for comments. Some, I have to admit, are lazy, and so the Washington chapters are close at hand. So Julius was often giving interviews and making statements on behalf of the entire organization, which he had no real right to do. So that was one thing, and Julius was not a retiring figure. So I was sent down, and pretty soon became, with Julius's agreement, the co-chair of Washington CORE, and that became part of what I did, and so on, and at times trying to get Julius to moderate some of his positions, which of course he never did.
And of course, it turned out after his death, you discovered that he had been an informant for the FBI.
Yes. He had a relationship to the FBI. I would ask him. He was a GS-13, an economist for the Social Security Administration, and of course I was working for Bobby Kennedy at the time. Both of us were getting arrested. Our names were in the paper. I would pass that on to Bobby Kennedy and ask him if that was any problem, and be assured it wasn't. And I would ask Julius, well, doesn't anybody put pressure on you? He said, no, I'm okay. What I didn't know is there was an FBI agent who maybe weekly would come and visit him in his office and ask him, how are things going, and so on. He was never on the payroll of the FBI, with one exception. He was asked to go up to the 1964 Democratic Convention, and they paid his way up, and maybe, like, I suppose you'd call it an honorarium these days.
So when you came to Washington, you're still a young guy, a really young guy, in your 20s. You find yourself, you go to work for the U.S. government, all of a sudden you find yourself on all these prestigious committees. How did this come about? And some of these committees were populated by some very well-known people in in the history of American politics. How did you find your way onto this, and what were some of the things that you worked on?
Well, my first job was in the Department of Labor. Since I had a background in education, I was doing some work in the Bureau of Training. Again, very, very dull, writing training manuals. And I found out that also within the Department of Labor was the Secretariat for the President's Committee on Youth Employment. And so I decided to go up to the top floor of the Labor Department and find out, volunteer, to see if I can get a staff position at this presidential committee. And I had no appointment. It was headed by a special assistant to the Secretary of Labor. Secretary, of course, asked me, did I have an appointment? And I said no, but I wanted to talk to him about the President's Committee on Youth Employment. She said, well, he doesn't have time for you today. And I said, that was okay, I'll wait. And then I came back the next day, and I waited. And finally, I think he was leaving about 5 o'clock, and the secretary then, as he was coming out, said, well, this young man wants to talk to you about the President's Committee on Youth Employment. So he said, I don't have much time. What do you want to talk about? And I said, well, I've looked at what the President's Committee is doing, and you're supporting two pieces of legislation, the Youth Conservation Corps and the Neighborhood Youth Corps, both sponsored by then Senator Hewitt Humphrey from Minnesota. And I said, I was part of the original oral history program that Alan Nevins had founded at Columbia. And I had done a study of the Civilian Conservation Corps as part of that. And I done a study of John W. Studebaker, who had interviewed him, who was the longest serving U.S. Commissioner of Education. He said, so? I said, do you have anybody with an education background on your team? And he said, no. I said, well, I think you can use me. And he said, okay. And so it was an internal transfer. They didn't have to spend any more money or anything like that. And so I went to work there. After a while, that became boring because it was clear that this legislation was not going to go anywhere. What's not remembered so well is President Kennedy had a great deal of difficulty getting any legislation through, because although the Senate and the House, but particularly the Senate, was controlled by the same party, the Democratic Party, they were Southern Democrats. And Kennedy was a Northern Democrat, and in their eyes, quite liberal. And they weren't about to put his legislative program through. And so I began to see and be recruited, actually, by another presidential committee, that called the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency. And that did have funds. That was one of the few pieces of legislation that President Kennedy had been able to get through, and it was headed by Robert Kennedy. And it was a three-agency triumvirate with Robert Kennedy at its head, but included labor and HEW. And so again, I could go to work for this presidential committee without them having to hire me anew. And so it was all very fluid and easy, and that's where I wound up.
Well, you spent a lot of time with Bobby Kennedy. At least it sounded that way from the book. Tell us about him. What was he like? I really gathered from the book that of the three prominent Kennedy brothers, he seemed to be your number one.
Yes. Well, I don't want to leave the impression that I spent a lot of time with him, because that's not the case. But the time I spent was typically memorable. I suppose several stories. One about, let's say, going back to the Civil Rights Movement. So I was concerned about working for Bobby Kennedy, and particularly in the Civil Rights Movement, because he was being pressed, as both brothers were, for the Civil Rights Act. And I was getting arrested. My name was in the paper, sometimes more than that. And so one morning, Monday morning, I went in and talked to David Hackett, who in turn talked to Bobby Kennedy. David Hackett was executive director of the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, and Bobby Kennedy's closest friend. They had been roommates at Milton Academy, and a book that's written about their relationship called A Separate Peace is about that relationship, often read in high school and boarding schools. And so I said, look, it's, you know, if it's choice between being active in the civil rights movement or working on your staff, I will resign the staff position because I'm not going to stop that. And the word that came back was it's okay, you know, do what you're doing. It's all right if you get arrested. Just don't get arrested soliciting small boys at Lafayette Park. Yeah. And I thought that was very funny at the time. Later I thought, well, I guess that's an example of homophobia, right? And you know, what's important and what. And of course, it wasn't too many months or years later that Walter Jenkins, a top aide to President Lyndon Johnson, was arrested for almost that at Lafayette Park and had to resign in disgrace. The other contacts that I had, I suppose, that were maybe somewhat more meaningful and significant. I found Bobby Kennedy at times very shy, and at times not. People ask me, well, how could you get along with that crowd? And I would say it's easy because I can speak Boston. And then they'd ask me, well, what do you mean by speaking Boston? I said, well, speaking Boston is not the Boston accent of Harvards and Cars and all of that. Speaking Boston is you never let the other person finish a sentence. and so I understood that, you know, that very quick back and forth. But I would travel with Bobby Kennedy whenever there was an education issue. We had these demonstration projects, eventually about 16 of them around the country. And I remember once in particular, I think it was probably in Harlem, we had an organization called How You Act, which was a merger of an Adam Clayton Powell sponsored organization and a Kenneth Clark sponsored organization. Very difficult marriage between these two. And so we went up for a visit. And something happened that was fairly, let's say was not uncommon. Bobby Kennedy was talking to a small group of kids, and there was one kid who was kind of hanging back. He wasn't even within the periphery. He was just outside. And Bobby Kennedy was sort of drawn to that. He said what he had to say, talked to kids and so on. This kid wasn't participating. And he went through the crowd and he sought out this kid. And the two of them went down the street and they sat on the curb together. And nobody took a photo, nobody talked about it. He never said what he talked about or anything like that. And it was an appreciable period of time. And there was something that you could see that struck him, that somehow, despite all of his background and the privileges and all of that, he knew what it was to be an outsider. He felt that. I thought that was really important.
You know, that's a pretty telling anecdote. Now, I don't want to. We're kind of going chronologically here,
Sure.
but I do want to jump ahead. When he was the horrible assassination of Bobby Kennedy, you were given quite an honor.
Well, I guess. I mean, I'm sure there were others but I was an honorary pallbearer around the coffin when it was in state in St. Patrick's Cathedral.
Now, you also worked with Kennedy brother-in-law Sargent Shriver. You worked with him quite a bit. What did you work with him on, and what kind of man was he?
Well, I'll jump back a little bit because there's a Bobby Kennedy connection. Prior to the creation of the War on Poverty, or the Office of Economic Opportunity, there was something called a task force on poverty. And I had been doing the education aspects of the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency. And those efforts were seen as a possible model for the community action program. And so Bobby Kennedy asked me, pretty much told me, but said, look, I want you to go over to the task force and represent our experience in education and community participation, parental involvement on that task force, which I did. And we formed together with two others, we formed sort of like an education subcommittee of the task force, and got involved in writing sections, not only of the bill, but of the report, which defined what the allowable educational activities would be under the Economic Opportunity Act, which later became very, very important. So that was my first real contact with Shriver. And of course, Johnson had insisted that Shriver didn't want to take the job, and Shriver stayed at the Peace Corps when doing all this, the rest of the work at the same time. And then it was through that experience then I gravitated to, once the legislation was done, to the Office of Economic Opportunity, and became basically the first education director at the Community Action Program Central Office.
Well, there's a good vignette in the book about you going over to Shriver's house and sitting out on the veranda or the back porch or whatever, and watching the kids just kind of going crazy, including Maria Shriver.
Yes, well, this was a time, it was about the creation of Upward Bound, or what would become Upward Bound. And I had sent a memo through various people to Shriver proposing that there be a national demonstration of pre-college programs, not unlike the national demonstration of Head Start, which I also had some involvement in. And so Shriver invited me to come out and talk about it. And so we sat on his back porch, a veranda, overlooking a large field. And he was asking me some questions, and we had this little bit of a back and forth. And out in the field, I think the oldest Shriver son, maybe Tim, I don't know, maybe that's, was driving a tractor, and maybe he was 12 at the time. And the four other kids were on the back of a cart that was being pulled by the tractor, and they were trying to push each other off, and the tractor was going, and not having been married and had no kids or anything, and I'm looking at this, and Shriver's talking to me, and I'm trying to look at him and look at that, and so on. It's these kids aren't going to survive the afternoon. Well, one of them's going to get drawn under those wheels, and so on. And finally he said, "Oh, this goes on all the time. But, it was an everyday occurrence."
That's funny. Well, you mentioned the War on Poverty, which really was sort of the aftermath of the Civil Rights Movement, and it was a big part of Lyndon Johnson's legislative agenda. And so you worked on committees on the War on Poverty, but specifically, and you've already alluded to them just briefly, Head Start and Upward Bound. You created Upward Bound, and you were very instrumental in the creation of Head Start. Talk to us about both those programs, and then working on the whole War on Poverty issue.
Well, at OEO, we had been doing some early childhood programs, some through community action agencies, but probably more importantly for this story, Francis Keppel, who had been my dean at Harvard, was now the U.S. Commissioner of Education. And he knew we had money, and he was in a much more restricted budget. I mean, we had an open-ended budget. And so he called me up and said, "Stan, we have this set of early childhood research and demonstration programs." There were Marty and Cynthia Deutsch in New York at, I think at NYU. There was somebody else at the University of Chicago, somebody else, Susan Peabody, in Nashville at George Peabody College. And he said, "Could we send those over to you and you pick up the funding? It seems to be much more related to you than it is to us." And of course, that wasn't exactly true, but Frank had this wonderful way of just bringing you in and so on. He was a wonderful, wonderful person, very innovative, and more should be written about him. So it took them over. And I managed to visit some of them in the field. We didn't have a lot of time for that. So it was now at the point of the anti-poverty program. President Johnson and Shriver, to some extent, were worried that there was this anti-poverty effort. There was the Job Corps, of course, but what was community action producing? What were the programs? What could he point to, and so on? And so there was this concern that not enough was being done. So I got a call from Shriver one morning, which is not unusual because Shriver did not believe in vertical organizations. He believed that anybody within an organization could call him directly and he could reciprocate. So that it wasn't unusual for the time. And he said that he had been to a party the night before, and somebody, I think it was Yuri Bronfenbrenner, a well-known sociologist, had said to him, according to Sarge, that Sarge, we have all these well-educated women in the country now with not enough to do, considering the time, right? This is 1963, not 64, not enough to do. And we have all these poor kids who are really in need of greater service. Can't you put something together that really engages these two population groups? So I said, well, I know, Stan, that we're doing these research and development programs. Could you call them together to a meeting in Washington and see if they would support a major summer demonstration of early childhood development? I said, well, how major? And he said, well, let's say $25 million. That's how we would go. And I said, okay. So I called him up and started to put together the meeting. And then one of my colleagues, a guy named Bill Ryu, who was working for Keppel, said, well, Stan, we just can't have the meetings of this group because this is an important decision. We have to broaden the representation. So we invited a guy named Jimmy Himes, who is head of the American Nursery School Association, and other early childhood experts, and so on. So it didn't become too large a meeting, but there were probably maybe 20 invitees. 3 days before the meeting, I got another call from Shriver. He said, Stan, President Johnson just called me, and he wants you to invite a philosophy professor from the University of Texas to come to the meeting. And I said, what does a philosophy professor know about early childhood development? And Shriver said, well, I asked President Johnson the same thing. And the president said, well, his name is John Silber, and he knows everything about everything. Now, John Silber later became president of Boston University, and a distinguished, if somewhat controversial, career. I called him up. He did come. He did participate. He had good ideas. So the meeting goes on. And as you or others in the academic community probably know, when you invite researchers to a meeting, they want to talk about their research. So the meeting went on, and finally everybody pined in about whether it would be efficacious, whether it would be okay to have a national early childhood program. And mood went back and forth and so on, pros and cons. It was getting to be about, well, maybe 1:30, 2 o'clock. And since I'd bought everybody's plane ticket, I knew when the earliest flights were. And nobody broke for lunch. I brought in sandwiches. And I said, well, look, it's not coming to any consensus. I'm going to do something probably as unusual for you. I'm going to posit something, and I'm going to ask for an up or down vote, and I want to see a show of hands, which is kind of ballsy for a young kid to do in that setting. So I posited a national demonstration, $25 million that following summer. I took a vote. Meeting broke up. I called Shriver back. Talked to first Marianne Orlando, his secretary, and she put me through. And I described the meeting, and I said, we took a vote. He said, well, tell me, what was the vote? And I said, so I don't think you're going to like it, because it was about 50-50. And he said, that's okay. I think we're going to go ahead. Now, I don't want to imply that that was the only meeting. Shriver was famous for doing multiple parallel efforts and so on. I'm sure there were other meetings and other people involved, but anyway, that was my connection to it.
And out of all this came Head Start and Upward Bound, both of which, well, Upward Bound is really your baby. Those are great accomplishments. And Upward Bound and Head Start are still active.
Yes.
I believe I saw recently where you said there's still 65,000
per year
that go through the Upward Bound program. And the success rate has been tremendous. Tell us a couple of things that have come out of that, some of the statistics.
Well, the general statistics are that Upward Bound graduates who are, by definition, low-income students, and most of whom would not even aspire to college, get admitted to a much greater degree than others of similar low-income background. They stay in school longer, and their graduation rates are much greater. So it becomes a very, very positive experience. And I think there are 4 members of Congress who are Upward Bound graduates, 2 astronauts, generals, people in the media.
I know when I was in high school, I spent a summer working for Head Start.
Oh.
And I still remember that experience to this day. It was one of the best experiences I ever had. Great learning experience. Talking about education, throughout the book there's several common themes, and you've already touched on a couple of them. Community involvement, preschool programs, after-school programs, and summer school programs are big foundations, I think, of your philosophy. Why is that, and why are they so vital, do you think?
Well, they are vital, but in my experience, they came out of a particular historical circumstance. For those who are interested in education policy, and education history, the late 1950s and early 1960s for the federal government was a period of a great wariness of the federal government being involved in education, particularly elementary and secondary education. I talked about my study or interview with John W. Studebaker, who had been Commissioner of Education for 14 years between 1934 and 1948. He overlapped FDR. Well, when the Civilian Conservation Corps was created, FDR thought that the Office of Education was the logical place to create the education curriculum of the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so he turned to John W. Studebaker, who flatly turned him down and said, no, it's not the role of the U.S. Office of Education to create a curriculum which could well become a national curriculum. Our education program is state and local, and this is a danger, and I will resist it. And Roosevelt went back to him at least 3 times, and he turned him down each time. And the education program, finally, in the Civilian Conservation Corps was done by the Army. So when now you come to the late 1950s, and the bare beginnings of federal involvement in education, in elementary and secondary and so on, becomes through one act, the National Defense Education Act. It was given the aura of this is central to our national defense, right? And there may be a science program, small program, but this was the one exception. So when I came in the early 1960s, there was basically a prohibition against federal aid to education, particularly during the regular school day. That was not the role of the federal government. So at the President's Committee on Juvenile Delinquency, we worked around the periphery. What's the periphery? Preschool, after school, summer school. And so that same view carried over into the Economic Opportunity Act. And then basically I became almost like the final judge from the field of whether a particular program fit that circumstance. The other big circumstance, of course, was the church-state issue, and that became something difficult that we had to work around. And there's a story in the book. If you wanted to hear that, I could
go into that for us.
So some of the first proposals that came in were the size of small telephone books, and had an education component. The one from Los Angeles involved the Catholic Youth Organization, which was proposing to run an after-school program for all kids in a particular series of neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And they would be bused in to the Catholic Youth Center for an after-school program. Well, since I was reviewing this, I immediately saw, well, that's a church-state issue. Kids would be bused in to a facility where there would be religious statues, religious artifacts on the walls, and so on. How could we deal with that? I immediately called Shriver up and said, I think we got a problem. And he said, what is it? And I told him. He said, come down right away. And he called Don Baker, who was the general counsel of OEO, in, and we had immediately a general meeting. Everything was immediate in those days. So I explained the situation to Don Baker, and he looked around, he looked at me, and he said, don't worry, I don't think it's a problem. He said, I've got a blanket solution for it. And we all looked at him, and here was a major issue that was dividing the country, certainly the Congress. What was he going to propose? And he said, what? And we said, well, what's your solution? He said, it's easy. Before you bust the kids in, you take blankets and you put them over the statues and the things on the wall. And we did.
And it worked.
It's called policy on the fly.
Also, during your educational professional career, you did a lot of work in the prison systems with education. And I think it's really interesting for people who are not as old as you and I to realize that back then, Attica they had a huge prison riot there. Rahway in New Jersey, huge prison riot there. And a lot of it was due to the lack of any educational programs in the prisons. And you got involved in that. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, at the time, I was Assistant Commissioner of Education for the state of New Jersey, and I had been appointed by Governor Dick Hughes. And the prison system was not under the Department of Education, but we had a very strong department that we had reformed in the process. And the commissioner was Carl Marburger, who had been one of my associates and partners at the early task force on poverty. And so we went through that experience and kind of promised each other if there was ever an opportunity to work again, we would do that. He gets appointed Commissioner of Education, asked me to join him and basically become head of research and development and new ideas. And so what I decided to do, and I don't know quite what caused me to do it, may have been a story in the paper, I'm not sure, but I became concerned about and didn't know what kind of education program was in the prisons. And so I started my own tour with the agreement of another department called the Department of Institutions and Agencies, which had the state prisons. And since our offices were in Trenton, I first looked at Trenton State Prison. And Trenton State Prison probably went back to the 18th century. I mean, it does early 19th century. If you could imagine going into a place where the rooms were these small caverns with scalloped ceilings that were designed for maybe a single person or maybe two, and now had 4 people, with no real ventilation. Of course, the air conditioning was unknown. Where the visiting area, half the phones were broken, so you couldn't really talk to anybody on the inside. And the education program was basically an old room with a few broken chairs, no books, and somebody who was very much a part-time teacher. And from there I went to other prisons, and the most modern of the prisons, which was still probably 30, 40 years old, was Rahway Prison. And the warden took me around and simply not much education going on. He was more sympathetic to doing more. This was now after Attica. And this is 2 weeks later after I visited there. There was a smaller riot. The warden was stabbed in the back. And the then Governor Cahill was very courageous, went up and did not send the troops in, as Rockefeller had done in Attica, and was able to negotiate a settlement out, and which was very courageous and was a very good job. But based on my experience, I then proposed something that I called the Garden State School District. And what that was the big issue was, of course, money. It's always money. How could you fund that any kind of education improvement? So what I decided to do is that we would take a statistical survey. We know all of the inmates and all their education backgrounds, and that any inmate with less than a high school education would be counted as part of the state school aid formula. In other words, in terms of aid, that institution would be allocated that sum of money as if they were a school. And the Garden State School District was made up of all the prisons and all of those schools. And that would be the money that was set aside. And since it was, in a sense, buried in the general school allocation formula, it was not a big issue that would stand up. And I drafted a piece of legislation, created the Garden State School District, but I wasn't going to let that stay within the same place that had allowed guns and guard uniforms to be considered over education. And so we agreed that the Garden State School District would be run in part by the Department of Education. And I wanted somebody who was a non-traditional educator. And so I recruited a recent retiring vice president of Johnson & Johnson who had a doctorate in educational psychology. And he became the first superintendent. And then it became, to some extent, a model, but later in some kind of reform, political winds changed, it got wiped out.
It was a very clever program, though. The way you got that instituted, that's great. Now, you mentioned at that time you were living in New Jersey, and your wife, who has her own very interesting background, she got involved in politics there. And somehow, she ended up on Richard Nixon's enemies list in 1973. Now, without revealing too much, how did she get this honor? I would consider it an honor to be on that enemies list.
Well, she had worked for Frank Mankiewicz, who was very much involved in the McGovern campaign, and I think through that got involved in different ways in the McGovern campaign. And so there were four. I remember her picture was on the front page of the Trentonian, with Frank Mankiewicz and Archibald and I forget her last name. There were four people and so on. So it was a pretty long list. It wasn't, nationally.
Well, that's great, though.
Yeah.
Jumping ahead a few years, you ended up moving to Maryland. You moved to Columbia when it was really just starting out as one of the planned communities. And you formed this National Committee for Citizens in Education. And you yourself wrote a study called Children, Parents, and School Records. And that work of yours eventually became the basis for the FERPA law, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Tell us a little bit about that, how you got involved, and how the act eventually got passed.
Okay. I have to amend your question a little bit. I was one of the founders of the National Committee for Citizens Education. I did it with Carl Marburg, who had been the state superintendent of schools, and Bill Ryu, who had been one of my associates at the Task Force on Poverty, and assisted Frank Keppel and later became president of the Merrill Palmer Institute in Detroit. And the three of us came together again and formed what basically was a cross between a common cause for public education and a Ralph Nader type group. We received no public funds, no government funds. It was all privately funded. And part of our task was to also oversee particularly the parental and citizen involvement aspects of federal education programs, and to try to build up a national organization made up of citizen and parents concerned about school reform. So that was the base of it. The actual study was done by the National Committee, but the authors were Bill Ryu and a guy named Stuart Sandow. And what the study did is basically look at a situation that was very common in those days. Let's assume you were a parent of a youngster, and there was a school record, of course, made of your youngster's grades, but also teacher comments. You could be going through a divorce, and the teacher might make a comment, you know, John's going through family going through a divorce. I don't know who's at fault, but he seems to be very angry at his father and so on. Completely outside of somebody's teaching responsibilities, but that would be part of the record. You would never know about it because you didn't have the right to see your own children's school record. And so we wrote the study and the book, and Parade magazine got a hold of it and decided that they would review it. And they reviewed it, but they also put a picture in Parade magazine of a young elementary school kid, maybe 6-year-old, 8-year-old, kissing a little girl, right? And the caption said, behavior like this could cost your child future employment possibilities, job possibilities. We get over 10,000 letters on the basis of that article. Just swamped us. One of the letters came from James Buckley, who was the then senator, conservative senator from New York, and he said, I'm really concerned about this. I want to do something about it. And so he decided that he would have hearings. At the same time, we had correspondence or contact with a liberal Democrat from the House. His name was Ed Koch. So the hearings came about, and there were some people who really couldn't understand that that was an issue. And one of them was Barry Goldwater Jr., the son who was then a congressman, of the father who was who had been a senator. And he said, I don't think that this is a real issue. I can't believe this is an issue. And so we told him, look, you're in Los Angeles. Go to the FBI office in Los Angeles. You're a congressman. Ask for your FBI record. We all have FBI. Ask for. So he got his FBI record, and he found that his entire school's transcript, including teacher comments, was part of his record. And he called back and he said, tell me what I wanted. What can I do? So this was something that was unusual in these days, in particular, a bipartisan effort. So the hearings were held. So our study had probably exclusively focused on elementary and secondary education. And what the Act, original design, said that parents should have the right to view their own children's school records, challenge anything that they feel is unfair, inaccurate, biased, and have that information removed. They also had the right to review communications that went from the school to colleges and universities. And that's where Buckley had expanded it beyond. We didn't disagree with that. The General Counsel of Harvard University came down together with a number of higher education institutions to strongly disagree with the Act, with the proposal. But it went through, and now it's called the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, called FERPA, passed in 1974. And every student who fills out a college application is often asked in the application to waive their rights if they want their guidance counselor or high school teacher to send unexamined comments. And it's up to the student to do that. You don't have to do that.
And it's still a huge issue. Still a huge issue. Yeah. So, moving forward a little bit, as if politics and all your involvement in that, and war on poverty and the civil rights movement and education reform weren't enough, you've also dabbled in some filmmaking. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess two films are probably noted. One in the book and one more recent. In the mid-1980s, I decided to join a couple of friends and create a small documentary film company that we call Cross Currents. And we were looking for projects, and we came across a book called Hemingway in Cuba, written by Norberto Fuentes. And in the book, it was described something that was not known to most Americans, particularly even those who had taken college literature courses and so on, that arguably our most famous, or one of our most famous writers of the 20th century, Ernest Hemingway, had lived much of his adult life in Cuba, outside of Havana. And there was a strong Cuban influence, or Spanish influence, in much of his writing. And so we decided to make a documentary about that, about Hemingway in Cuba. And was able, even though there was an embargo at the time, to send a film crew down to Cuba and get the involvement of the Cuban film authorities to begin to put this together. And we interviewed both of Hemingway's surviving sons, the captain of his fishing boat, Gregorio Fuentes, who lived to 102, and his doctor, his Cuban doctor, Norberto Fuentes, who was the author of the book, and capture a lot of film material. I just decided this past year to donate a copy of the film to the Hemingway collection at the John F. Kennedy Library. Anyway, so that's that film. The more recent film was about human rights in Burma, and I had formed an early friendship with Jack Healy, who was president of Amnesty USA for a dozen years, and was the leading spirit behind the U.S. tour and the world tour of directly engaging the leading musicians in the human rights issue, Sting and U2 and Tracy Chapman and Bruce Springsteen and so on. And so we did a film on human rights in Cuba and Aung San Suu Kyi and her house imprisonment. What we wanted to do in the film, it's always good to have an audience for a film or a website or whatever you do that's going to be widely seen, obviously a book. Our audience were about 6 generals in Burma. And what we wanted to show them was that Aung San Suu Kyi had widespread support in the United States. And so we were able to get George Bush on camera, George Bush the younger, Bill Clinton, Mitch McConnell, John McCain, Nancy Pelosi, and then a number of actresses and the artistic and creative community, all of this, and speaking to the camera that Aung San Suu Kyi should be free. Now jump several years later, 2012, Aung San Suu Kyi visits the United States, and I'm invited up to New York to have lunch with her, and I'm able to bring a copy of the film and hand it to her. And she smiled, and I'm sure she knew about the film, because at the time we made the film, we premiered at the Fox Studios in Hollywood, and the Burmese government in exile, she couldn't come in, flew in to see it, and then we beamed the film via Norwegian satellite into Burma, and people got arrested just for seeing it. So.
Well, that brings up something that I completely jumped over, and I want to apologize because we're going to have to go back in time just a little bit. I don't know how I could have leapt over this, but back to your civil rights days. You were working on the committees for the government. You were still involved with CORE and the civil rights movement, and you were involved quite in a lot of detail with the famous March on Washington in 1963. Tell us about that and your experience with Martin Luther King's speech.
Well, the real the organization was interesting. The four key civil rights organizations agreed on the March on Washington many months earlier. It had been first proposed by A. Philip Randolph, threatened to FDR, and of course he wanted a civil rights act and so on, and that never came about. There was a very modest Civil Rights Act in 1957. But the issue came up again. Here the civil rights movement was all over the South and in the North, all these demonstrations and so on. So it was a scene we wanted a scene of the coming together of everything that was there, and then to push the movement forward, not just in Washington, but back out into what we call the field. So the organization was delegated by the four civil rights organizations, CORE, NAACP, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to their local organizations in Washington. We were supposed to do the detail work. The actual big organizational work was done in New York by a man who has largely been forgotten and should be written about and written about and written about, Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was the organizational genius. He did all of the outside organizing of the buses that came from Chicago and Milwaukee and Detroit and all of that, all the major New York press stuff and so on. Our work was training people locally and also dealing with the local security, which Bayard really helped us with. And so in the evenings we would train our people in nonviolent resistance as part of the security mechanism. But we still had to deal with the police. We didn't trust the DC police. They were the same police who were arresting us on weekends, throwing us in the back of the paddy wagon, clearly racist, not to be trusted. So how could we bridge what we were going to do internally within the march and externally where the DC police would have some functions? And I believe it was Bayard who came up with the idea of the Guardians, the New York Guardians. Now the New York Guardians were not the people that, I think it was named Slivka or something.
Sliwa.
Sliwa. It's not that group. It's an earlier group. These were a group of African American New York police officers. It was their organization. And so we basically contracted with them to be the external periphery security. And we held the DC police outside of that. And they, although racist, these were fellow police officers. And so, well, they could do arrests, and they carried handcuffs and so on. They couldn't carry arms, and so on. But they were clearly in coordination and so on. The inside of the march we had to handle directly, and our instructions and training were any kind of incident, we would immediately form a circle around that person, a nonviolent circle, and then call for police work. And we each had territory, and my territory was, if you look from the Lincoln Memorial towards the Capitol. It was immediately to the right and back to the edge of the beginning edge of the reflecting pool. And I think the only problems I had during that time was a couple of people fell out of the tree, and that was about it.
Well, a couple of things struck me about your story about the march. One was that you got a lot more people showing up than you had anticipated that was projected. And listening to you now, it sounds like Mr. Rustin was quite responsible for that with all the busing in from the outside cities.
Right.
And then secondly was your vantage point or your proximity to Martin Luther King as he made his most famous speech of all time.
Well, I wouldn't call it. I mean, I was back in the crowd with my group. I think what interested me the most, looking back at it, and first in terms of the crowd, is that most Washington demonstrations gather their largest crowd from the immediate Washington area. So that was one. The second thing that's often seen but not understood, if you look at the crowd, the March on Washington crowd, they are dressed up. People wear ties and jackets, women wear dresses and hats, some wear gloves and so on. We were all told, you dress as if you're going to church.
I was just going to say that.
And it was not accidental. We said that the people out there, the people we want to influence, are the people who dress the way we're going to dress, right? And subsequent demonstrations have lost that edge. They dress, however they want to dress, and so, and for many demonstrations, they are dismissed because of the way they look by a larger group of people who don't share their commitment, but because of the issue might tend to be more sympathetic if they saw themselves in those demonstrators.
Well, it's so true, because when you see some of the great photographs that were taken of that March on Washington, everybody, with the hats and the ties and the jackets and the women with that's a great strategy, great strategy. And I had no idea that it was a conscious decision on your part.
Yes. Yeah.
That's great. Well, we have time for just a couple of more questions, but I really want to ask you a couple more. You've worked with many presidents, including our current president, Obama, over the years. And I know this is tough and maybe an impossible question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who has impressed you the most and why?
Well, I would say you have to look at the role of the presidency. Both Kennedy and President Obama, I think, might be described as inspirational figures who, through the quality of their voice and speech and intellect, were and are able to attract many, many people who would not be attracted simply by the narrow self-interest of being involved in a particular program or by a particular group. But each of them share something that I think is common, and that having limited legislative experience are not the leading presidents for actually getting something through particularly a divided legislature or Congress. The one who, no doubt in my experience, was the master at this is Lyndon Johnson. Think of how my earlier story of how a president of the United States would know somebody who is 8 levels down, even though within the executive office of the president, was holding a meeting 3 days hence, right, and would call up and want to influence who came to that meeting. Lyndon Johnson had a level of detail and a grasp of how things really worked that is far beyond any of the presidents in my lifetime. any of them. There's a quick story I'll tell about the Job Corps. The second Job Corps, the first one was in Texas. The second one was in the Catoctin Mountains near Camp David. And both, talking about dress, Shriver wanted the Job Corps guys, when they were out, to dress with ties and sports jackets and jeans. He wanted them to look like prep school kids. Right? So Johnson said, well, we have to bring them to the White House, and we want to photo them, I want to meet them, and so on. So the kids come in from the Catoctin Mountains, and there's a photographer in the room, and he's setting them up on tiers, you know, the short ones here and the taller ones there. You stand like this and so on, positioning them all. Johnson comes into the room, and he looks at that, and he says, no, no. And he starts moving these kids around and so on, doing the kind of photo that he wanted, right? He knew that. He knew that instinctively. He had run the National Youth Administration in Texas, right? He had worked as a congressional aide. He knew all about the way photos are done. He knew the way the bureaucracy acted and so on. And the way he got a civil rights bill was the way only Johnson could have done it, right? He knew how to work with the Richard Russells, just that's masterful. Robert Caro's book, The Master of the Senate, and his most recent book, The Path to Power, and so on, and the one, of course, he's writing now that I hope to contribute to someday, is just a brilliant description. And the tragedy, of course, of Lyndon Johnson, which was the title of a book by Eric Goldman, one of my former professors at Columbia, was the Vietnam War. Otherwise, the concern about poverty, not the middle class, the concern about the poor would have continued on. Head Start would have been expanded upward bound. The Job Corps, we would have dealt with poverty in a way that would not have left us with the situation we have now.
He was very much a victim of the war, very much. And it was not of his choosing. We all have to remember when it started. Mm-hmm. So, one last question. You've worked on so many historically significant and valuable projects that have produced results that are still enduring to today. If you had to pick one, again, this is a tough question, but if you had to pick one that you are most proud of, which one would you choose?
Oh, it'd have to be Upward Bound. It'd have to be that.
And that is because?
Well, it connected. I mean, how does one get out of poverty or a poor circumstance? I mean, I came from a family where no one went to college. I knew what college meant to me, what that aspiration was, what financial aid meant, and so on, and I could see the results. You could see what made a difference, and I'm glad to see that over the years, Upward Bound has evolved into something called TRIO, where student support services is linked to it, and student financial aid, and so on. Upward Bound then has different variations, math and science, Upward Bound for veterans, and so on. So the concept has been expanded to various groups. I just wish that the present administration and Congress would do more for it.
Well, it is an enduring program. We have a TRIO program here at Montgomery College.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you so much for visiting with us today. It's been terrific. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.